Hey, I'm Chris Broussard. I'm going to talk a bit about my evolution of learning about harm reduction as a model and approach and constellation of tools for approaching addiction and treatment. Let me start with a general view of my general impressions of harm reduction. They're manifold because the whole concept of harm reduction is it's multifaceted, it's dimensional, and it's flexible. And as such, it's kind of difficult to talk about it as a single thing. It's kind of like, what are your general impressions of the universe? So it might be a little more interesting to talk about my own evolution on it. But I'll say in general, I'm convinced by the evidence regarding harm reduction um, methods that harm reduction as a model in theory should and will guide me as a mental health counselor, including what are regarded as the more controversial tools in the harm reduction toolkit. On a scale of 1 to 10, abstinence being 1 and harm reduction being 10, where do I fall on that spectrum of, how much do I believe in it versus abstinence? Uh, it depends on the person. There are clearly people who've benefited from abstaining from their drug of choice. They know deeply and viscerally they can't dabble or they'll go completely off the rails, and I want to support those people. I know too many people for whom the model of abstinence works, and their lives have been enriched by taking up a deeper approach to life that's often associated with abstinence, such as 12-step programs. And we know they work for a subset of people, and they're comprehensive in that they don't just say no to drugs. They say get connected, be supported, keep coming back, as we'll be here for you, and also don't be deluded that you don't have a disease that wants to kill you. So for these people, I'm a 1. Definitely abstinence is right for them. Speaking in general terms, again, for people whose only chance of making contact with other people who care about what happens to them and aren't going to steal from them or exploit them, um, if the only way for them to do that and be in contact is to say get some clean needles from a needle exchange, then I'm a 10 plus for harm reduction. Um, how do we know the difference between these types of people is the question. I'll talk a little more about it further, but I can look to my own experience, and that's the only one I can really know because this is such an essential question, something that gets to the deeper questions of who we are and also the contextual questions of what's going on in someone's life beyond the addiction, what's affecting things. Um, I've not always viewed harm reduction this way. The thought of handing an addict a needle, for instance, was unthinkable at the beginning of this semester when I started to learn more about this. And if I'm being honest, still turns my stomach a bit. Because in theory and the evidence, I know that this can save lives. And there's still part of me that feels I'm not handing that person the keys to their best life. So the difference between now and then for me is having a deeper sense of how that idea of their best life is what I'm seeing through my own lens and a value judgment on the situation. However, I'm not at that point of letting that go, and that's why I'm so interested in exploring what drugs are really doing for people in their neurobiology and by extension their social lives and ability to connect with other people. Some of us have different brains. Before we started using, that was the case. I have the enormous privilege of good health care, the good fortune of years of 12-step work with a just out just out of this world sponsor, the opportunity to hang out in a Zen monastery for a few years after that for the primary purpose of looking at my mind, um, and then attend grad school and learn more about the mind when finally, at the age of 49, after all that, and aided by a growing worry that I had dementia after feeling the precipitous effects of surgical menopause, I figured out that I have ADHD. And what I wouldn't have done to know that earlier in my life and gotten treatment, how things would be very different in my life. But the point is that this combination of things to gain this insight is rare, and I am lucky. when we think about the progression of ADHD to ODD to conduct disorder, or whatever framework we want to use, that's just how the DSM frames it. But we know that when people have trouble attending, they start to disconnect and things unravel. And one of the major researchers on ADHD points out that ADHD is just subclinical ODD. And the only difference being that emotional lability aspect. And that's just the way the DSM is written. So how many people out there right now with either this neurological constellation or some other thing that we haven't yet framed and so haven't yet treated are self-medicating like I was. I had a thing for stimulants. They were my drug of choice, of course. So how is my microdose of Adderall in the morning that brings my dopamine and norepinephrine levels up to normal functioning different from the heroin microdoses that they were given in Liverpool in Dr. Marx's clinic, that gave people what they needed to stabilize their lives? Many of us live in exceedingly difficult environments for neurotypical people, let alone people who are neurodivergent or have some as yet undefined set of circumstances neurologically and emotionally. And we don't know what we don't know. Just like Dr. Bradley with his miraculously no longer troubled boys in the 1930s. That could change people's lives now. And it's only the attitudes and brainwashing from the failed war on drugs driving that prejudice. It's certainly not neuroscience. And we should be vigilant for what works. So this is one way, this is one thing that I consider when I think of the ways of physiological dimensions of addiction should influence treatment through a harm reduction lens. I have to consider the function that a drug is serving in a person's life. I have to figure out if they have a disorder that predisposes them to substance use disorder. And I have to figure out how best in the current climate and systems to get those needs met for them, either through advocacy, working with their primary care physician if they have one, and helping them build support networks. And if I can get them to keep coming back for long enough to help them through some of these things, and not harping on them to be abstinent off the bat, it might be in order. Because if you take away the last thing touching their reward system without having some other things in place, I imagine that treatment could really go south and they're probably not going to be interested in coming back. And that is a professional miss. So what informs how I view harm reduction? So I definitely benefited from abstinence for some time. I consider myself recovered and I have a drink now and then. When I discussed this with my brother, my elder brother, who's a 23-year veteran of AA, he had a lot of judgment about it. And I told him, probably rather arrogantly, but I stand by it, that I don't think everyone can do this, meaning dabble in alcohol once they admit they have a problem. But my understanding of my mind was the result of unusually deep inquiry. And he tried to drive the point that I wouldn't have been able to see into the root of my own suffering. Cat is drooling. Bye-bye. Sorry, buddy. That I wouldn't have been able to see into the root of my own suffering in my monastic training had I been drinking. And maybe that's true. Maybe I would not have been able to see into the root of my own suffering had I been drinking. But I actually started drinking again a year after I went into training. And I'd go into town now and again on my short monastic weekend and have a beer. And that was it. And it's been like that for the past 6 years. So sometimes I'll have more than one, and I do see and feel the compulsive call. It's like a dragon that's still cunning, baffling, and powerful. And it doesn't make sense. And I concede that if I were to go off the rails, meaning start problem drinking as I define it, the first place I'll go is an AA meeting. But I have zero desire for the large swaths of cocaine or stimulants of the past, likely assisted by my morning microdose of levo and dextroamphetamine. But having said all this, I consider myself recovered, which certainly doesn't jibe with abstinence protocols. I recently came to find out that my dear brother has been unsober for several years now. All this time, he's been slipping in these judgmental questions, not on alcohol, but with another process addiction that he's dealing with and he's trying to get clean from. I told him he should probably get checked for ADHD. I'm pretty sure he has it. But it's sort of ironic, the ones with the most judgment, it's something that we're not really dealing with ourselves. So that's pretty much all we need to know about judgment. Culture, subculture, experience of culture, oppression, and accessing harm reduction treatment. So when I think about my own fortuitous experience of recovery and all the ways that harm reduction has benefited me, from medical amphetamines to living in a non-judgmental environment, I experienced the world as a queer, white, cisgendered woman. I did some hard work, and at times I wanted to die, but my hills were obviously climbable, and they weren't littered with extra obstacles. But if I was Black, given my history, I would have definitely already spent some time in prison. I could have been diagnosed with conduct disorder based on some of my behaviors at school. And someone who was Black in that position would have had an entirely different carceral trajectory. And so perhaps that young Black person eventually gets out of jail, but their employment and their school has been disrupted and they have a record and they're not going to be able to stabilize their life unless they have some benefactors. And we know where the resources for such beneficence are, and it's mostly not in Black neighborhoods, for example. The cycle of poverty and use continues. And services for communities of color are often harder to access. They're placed in unfortunate locations, and people in lower socioeconomic, with lower SES neighborhoods are often working jobs that aren't flexible enough to get to clinics. And so I was looking at some numbers from the Pew Trust, and Black patients are 77% less likely to be prescribed buprenorphine, which is a proven partial opioid agonist, and are unfortunately more likely to receive methadone treatment, if anything at all. And so while these are both FDA approved to treat opioid use disorder, it creates issues with access. One, methadone is a much more restricted regimen. Most patients have to show up daily to be administered the medication, which can make it nearly impossible to keep a job or manage other obligations. Also, over-reliance on methadone for the uninsured and publicly insured patients who are disproportionately Black in urban settings. That can preclude individuals from accessing one of the other approved medicines that could be more effective for them. And so these factors are real barriers to treatment for Black patients and all low-income individuals. And much of the focus of the opioid epidemic is on the impact of prescription drug misuse. And so the remedies and the responses often ignore the needs of those engaging in IV drug use. So in cities, Pew gave Baltimore, for example, there's been a 70-year opioid epidemic, meaning heroin use in the Black community, and many people aren't receiving sufficient care. We think of the opioid epidemic as something recent, but for many communities, it's been here all along. And the focus on prescription drug misuse is very much driven by the increasing mortality of white people suffering from this disorder. And Black people are just much more likely to be arrested for minor crimes like drug possession. And so one of Oregon Measure 110's aims was to reduce the proportion of Black people who end up in prison. And this is a good reason. And I think the main reason that I voted for this measure, because while I have major issues with Measure 110, and I think it should be revisited, I don't know of any other way to address that right now. And poor people with drugs is very low-hanging fruit for the carceral state, and it's being used to jail men, frankly, of childbearing age, and it has whiffs of genocide, and that can't continue. So harm reduction really needs to be made more available to vulnerable communities and BIPOC communities. Thinking about harm reduction and how it's different than traditional methods, traditional models of addiction and recovery. Maybe it's not so different. I imagine we don't just give up on people in the HR and the harm reduction model. A 12-step sponsor isn't bound by professional ethics and is empowered to let sponsees go if they don't feel like they can help them. And this can happen when a sponsor gets impatient. But otherwise, most sponsors are going to see someone who's gone out on maneuvers, as they say in the rooms, and welcome them back to the fold and try to get them connected with what's helpful in that model, meaning meetings, phone calls, and abstinence. 12-step work, though, acknowledges that there is something cunning, baffling, and powerful that pulls us back into addiction. And we can think of this as the dopamine reward circuit gone too far, because there's something deeply spiritual that can stand in for this drug. Um, there may be a mediating neurochemical solution, pharmacological therapy, either in the form of medication to treat a mental health issue or something like methadone, that can directly address the overactivated dopamine reward system. But if the contributing conditions are not resolved, the ones that might moderate our internal processes, housing, connection, the relief of existential angst, then it's not a whole solution. And harm reduction approaches addiction holistically with an understanding that perfection is the enemy of the good, and that any positive direction might save lives and bring someone closer to where they want to be in terms of their values. And I can see myself educating people on their options, knowing if people know that they're going to experience unconditional positive regard, whatever shape or stage of recovery they're in, is key for building trust and support and rapport. And we can explore whether abstinence makes sense. For many people, it does. And it's not something you necessarily need to get perfect the first time, for first 10 times you aspire to it. But it's really about exploring what their values are, I think. And do they want to get clean? Or do they just want to learn to function while still getting fixed? Or do they just want to pass their UA and get back to their habit? And in any of these instances, it's my job to get them to understand what function that substance is serving, and ideally explore and educate on a multitude of options. And we can find out if there's a co-occurring disorder, the treatment of which could reduce their problems, including the problem substance behavior. I imagine if I find myself working in a center where harm reduction is frowned upon, I could share my own evolution on this subject, and possibly open some minds. So some salient takeaways from the semester. Mostly on my mind is like shame and self-worth. There's so much of it wrapped up in addiction. It might be at the root of the addiction, and it certainly comes along with problem substance use, from society on down to family members, and absolutely the loud inner critical voice really leaves one wanting to shut it up in any way possible. And so self-compassion would be a very important component for treatment for someone committed to abstinence who might be having trouble. There may have been or may come repeated failures, and that can just compound the issue of shame. And depending where they are, this can look different. This could be a deep meditative exercise, or it can just be introducing the concepts, just the idea that they are worthy of their own compassion, and maybe just starting with the way that they talk to themselves. Sometimes we don't even realize that we have this voice. Connection, however it can come, is worth considering. So even a needle exchange, and I mentioned this one because it's the one I still need to explore because of that internal cringe that I'm still feeling. So if someone walks in the door of my workplace because they want a clean needle, they can be shown some love and an alternative to might well be a nightmare day-to-day existence. In the process, it's worth leaning into the idea. We don't know what's going on with people. We don't know what's going to happen, but if we show them some care and some active listening and acceptance, meeting them where they are, we can at least begin to have a conversation about what makes sense to them in terms of change. And that's really a key takeaway for me too, is learning about what makes sense to them, and not dismissing their own internal wisdom. And some people are really not clear at all, but many are, and they know what they need and when they need it. Um, I want what I wanted when I wanted it is a slogan in 12-step rooms, and it's something that a 12-stepper tries to transcend. I want what I want when I want it. But the when is most often up to them. And I say this with deep acknowledgement of the ones who get clean in jail and never go back to using, and that was a good thing for them. That does happen, we know. And lastly, motivational interviewing is interesting to me, because working in that ambivalence is so often present with an addiction, pre-contemplation. Where am I? This day I want to get clean. This day I don't. Um, and so it's like getting to that when that I just mentioned, and increasing motivation incrementally in their time is known to work well. So this might be a good way to open things up and help drop levels of resistance and learn from them how change will best come about. So I learned a lot over the semester. I've definitely come around. I think a lot of um, my feelings about harm reduction were just out of a sense of hard work ethic, that you kind of pick up in 12-step rooms, and maybe just it's generational, I don't know. But making it easier for people to do drugs didn't seem like a good idea, especially looking around Portland right now. And the mere thought of just sort of like paving the way for people to use more was just deeply like anathema to me. I couldn't really come around to it. I felt like these attitudes are part of the problem. And my my feelings have shifted on it. I've just learned too much about the evidence, come to understand my own experiences, one having experienced harm reduction in a positive way, and like how much better my life is than it was 10 years ago, through my own process that I thought was just going to be abstinence and turns out not to have been. And I've never been healthier. So I've come around. I feel like I can advocate and probably teach others on the subject, a lot more so than I had before. Um, and abstinence works for people too. So yeah, thanks for everything. It's been a good semester.